There comes a time in the inner journey when one cannot go back. A line is crossed, not outwardly, not in action or appearance, but in the unseen architecture of the soul. You awaken one morning, and the world is not what it was. It has not changed, but you have. The veil has thinned, and reality begins to whisper its secrets. The first sign that you have passed such a threshold is a deep disorientation that paradoxically brings clarity. The familiar loses its grip, old pleasures no longer intoxicate, former goals seem hollow, and the narratives you once lived by feel strangely foreign. It is not that life has betrayed you, rather, it has initiated you. What once held authority over your sense of self crumbles under the pressure of something more authentic, more ancient, arising from within. Second, you begin to encounter symbols, not in books or churches, but in your dreams, your shadows, your chance encounters. Everything becomes charged with meaning. A crow on a windowsill is no longer just a bird, a recurring number. A slip of the tongue, a forgotten childhood memory, they come alive with a subtle voice. The world begins to feel animated. You do not merely observe life, you are spoken to by it. You find yourself inexplicably drawn to silence. Not because you are tired, but because noise can no longer touch the depth of what you are beginning to experience. The silence is not empty, it is full, full of presence, mystery, and invitation. Something waits for you there, and though you cannot name it, you feel it pulling you deeper into yourself. Relationships begin to shift. Some dissolve without conflict, others erupt with intensity. The soul has started its sorting. What no longer serves the direction of your becoming falls away. You don't push it, it simply cannot stay. And in this shedding, you feel grief, not just for what you lose, but for how long you lived outside your own truth. Yet simultaneously, there is peace, a quiet sense of destiny unfolding. You begin to sense the hidden architecture of your suffering. Wounds you once cursed now appear as doors. Pain has become your teacher, not because you are broken, but because you were never meant to remain shallow. You begin to suspect that the cracks in your life were necessary, even sacred. The trauma did not define you, it opened you. It refined you. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this asking of me?" Another sign. Time changes. The future loses its tyranny, the past its grip. You start to live in what could be called soul time, where synchronicity reigns. Events no longer seem random. You glimpse the intelligence beneath chaos. You begin to notice that life is not a linear path, but a spiral, circling ever closer to the center, to the essence, to the source. There is also a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when your identity detaches from the roles you've worn. You are no longer the mask, no longer the voice you adopted to belong. Instead, a deeper voice stirs, one that does not ask for approval or permission. It is the voice that has always been there waiting. It is quiet, firm, ancient. And when it speaks, you recognize it, not as something new, but as something forgotten. You might feel loneliness, but it is a sacred loneliness. The crowd cannot follow you here. They will not understand. You are no longer seeking to be understood. You are seeking to understand. This loneliness is not empty. It is the quiet before revelation. In this solitude, you are not abandoned. You are being prepared. The sacred always demands solitude before it unveils itself. You may find yourself pulled toward symbols, philosophies, scriptures, only to discard them again. The deeper truth cannot be found in any external system. They are fingers pointing, not the moon itself. What awakens in you is not borrowed, it is born. It arises from your own confrontation with darkness and your willingness to turn toward it instead of away. At some point, fear changes shape. The fear of death, failure, rejection, these begin to fade. In their place emerges a more profound fear, the fear of living falsely. The soul can no longer tolerate pretenses. Your inner compass sharpens. every compromise, every lie to yourself becomes unbearable. You would rather lose everything than betray the truth you now carry. Eventually, even the language of seeking begins to dissolve. You are no longer searching for something outside yourself. The journey is no longer about arriving. It is about deepening. You are no longer trying to escape the world or transcend it. You are learning how to embody the sacred within it. And here lies the final sign you become a vessel. Not in some grandiose way, but quietly, humbly. Life begins to flow through you. Your wounds become your wisdom. Your solitude becomes a sanctuary for others. You are not interested in converting or convincing. You are interested in presence, in authenticity, in bearing witness to the divine mystery that animates all things, even suffering, even death. Once this threshold is crossed, there is no return, but neither is there regret. For you have seen the deeper currents, you have heard the secret music, and now you must learn to dance with it, not to control it, but to surrender to it, not to explain it, but to serve it. The old self dissolves as deeper inner truth emerges, making return to former identities impossible. This transformation often begins subtly, with a sense of discomfort or restlessness that seems to have no clear source. It may start with dissatisfaction toward routines, ambitions, or identities that once felt fulfilling. The world remains unchanged in its external form, but the individual's inner relationship with it begins to collapse. What once provided meaning starts to feel hollow. Accomplishments feel like masks, relationships feel like roles, and conversations become echoes. The individual is not necessarily depressed or lost, but is standing at the edge of something that defies language. It is not destruction for its own sake, it is a sacred unraveling. The self that had been carefully constructed through years of conditioning, expectations, culture, and survival mechanisms begins to fragment. The narratives that held the ego in place weaken. One no longer finds the same pride in the titles they held or the images they projected. There is a growing gap between who they are and who they appear to be, and this gap widens until it cannot be ignored. The dissonance becomes unbearable, forcing the individual to abandon the performance of who they thought they were. It is as if the soul begins to revolt. It no longer permits lies to be told in the name of safety or belonging. It drags the person inward towards something more enduring than persona. In this space, identity no longer feels like a possession. It feels like a skin that is too tight, a costume that once fit but now stifles the breath. The stories that once explained one's life no longer apply. The desire to be seen in a certain way falls away. People may no longer recognize the individual, not because of dramatic changes in appearance or behavior, but because something essential has shifted beyond visibility. This disidentification is not passive, it demands a quiet courage. There is often grief, confusion, even terror, because letting go of who one has been feels like dying. And in a sense, it is. It is the death of the adapted self, the one who played by rules it did not create, lived in roles it did not choose, and agreed to realities that were never questioned. This death is not a failure, it is an initiation. It marks the beginning of a deeper relationship with the self, not as ego construct, but as inner source. It is the emergence of something unshakable, timeless, and rooted in mystery. As the deeper truth begins to emerge, it does so in fragments, images, intuitions. It rarely speaks in language at first. It reveals itself in dreams, bodily sensations, and strange longings. It has no interest in returning to who one was. It is not nostalgic, it is evolutionary. The inner truth does not ask for permission. It disrupts. It brings with it both liberation and loss. There may be a loss of social roles, of relationships, of external approval. But what is gained is an inner alignment that cannot be faked. The deeper truth demands honesty, not as morality, but as necessity. and the individual starts to speak differently, move differently, even think differently. Words are no longer chosen to manipulate or impress, they are chosen to reflect what is real. One begins to live from the inside out. Decisions are not made by fear or ambition, but by resonance. What feels aligned becomes more important than what looks right. The dissolution of the old self often brings with it resistance. The ego does not surrender easily. It tries to reclaim its territory by presenting new goals, new distractions, or even spiritual personas to wear. But the individual can no longer be seduced in the same way. The cost of returning to unconscious living becomes too great. It's not that one forgets how to pretend, it's that the body and soul reject the lie. The deeper truth acts like a fire, burning away what no longer serves. This fire is not cruel, but it is relentless. It demands purification. It will not tolerate compromises that silence the soul. In this process, clarity emerges, not as a fixed belief system, but as an embodied knowing. The individual no longer seeks validation outside, because the compass has turned inward. Integrity becomes the guiding principle, not as virtue signaling, but as survival. To live in dishonesty becomes a kind of death. The soul requires alignment the way the lungs require air. There is often a sense of solitude in this phase, not necessarily because others abandon you, but because you no longer belong to the same world. You begin to see the artificiality in many social rituals, the hidden agendas behind politeness, the fear behind aggression. It does not make you cynical, it makes you discerning. You realize that you cannot unsee what has been seen. The illusions have broken, and even if it would be easier to believe again, you cannot. The threshold has been crossed. This is the point of no return. The old ways of operating no longer apply. One can no longer shrink themselves to fit into old containers. The soul has grown, expanded, evolved. It now demands a new architecture of living. The individual becomes more sensitive, more attuned, not weaker but more porous. There is a kind of quiet authority that begins to emerge, not from dominance but from authenticity. The person no longer needs to control others because they have begun to master themselves. This mastery is not about perfection, it is about presence. The more the old self dissolves, the more space is made for presence. The more one lives in alignment with the deeper truth, the less fragmented they become. Energy that was once spent upholding false roles is now freed for creativity, intuition, and insight. The person does not become enlightened in the mystical sense. They become real. They become integrated. They become whole. And even though the journey is far from over, they have passed a point that cannot be reversed. The questions have changed. The values have changed. Even the experience of time and space begins to shift. The center of gravity moves from the external to the internal, from reaction to reflection, from image to essence. The need to perform dies quietly. The desire to be seen is replaced with the desire to see clearly. The person does not withdraw from life. They enter it more deeply, more consciously. They are no longer trying to escape their humanity. They are trying to embody it with reverence. They do not chase the light at the expense of the dark. They become willing to hold both. They begin to recognize that truth is not comfortable, but it is liberating. It is not always beautiful, but it is always real. And once the taste of the real has touched the soul, the counterfeit is forever exposed. Life becomes symbolically charged, revealing meaning through dreams, synchronicities, and inner guidance. What once appeared as coincidence begins to reveal a deeper, more intelligent pattern unfolding beneath the surface of reality. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. A song on the radio echoes a thought you just had. A stranger's words feel like they were meant for you. An image you see in a dream appears later in waking life. The world starts to speak in riddles, symbols, and metaphors, as though some hidden intelligence is trying to get your attention. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It comes softly, quietly, through small cracks in your daily awareness. The linear, rational mind begins to loosen its grip. And another kind of knowing rises, a knowing that does not come from books or logic, but from resonance and recognition. You don't always understand why something feels significant, but you feel it in your bones, as if a forgotten language is being reawakened within you. Dreams take on new importance. They are no longer dismissed as random firings of the unconscious, but are honored as messages from the deeper psyche. You begin to notice patterns, archetypes, recurring themes. A figure you once feared in a dream now feels like a guide. A landscape you wander in sleep mirrors an emotional landscape you are walking in waking life. The line between the inner and the outer begins to dissolve. What appears in the dreamscape begins to affect how you see the waking world, and vice versa. The psyche speaks in images, not in concepts. These images, whether in dream or symbol or intuition, start to pull you inward, deeper into yourself, asking to be understood not with analysis but with reverence. You begin to feel that nothing is random, nothing is meaningless. Every image carries a whisper from the soul. Synchronicities become like stepping stones across a river. They are not planned. They cannot be manufactured. They arrive when the inner world aligns with the outer. When your soul is in harmony with the flow of life, the events around you begin to mirror that harmony. A person appears just when you were thinking about them. A book falls off a shelf with the exact phrase you needed to hear. A number repeats itself until it becomes impossible to ignore. These moments are not superstitions, they are invitations. They call your attention to the invisible thread weaving your inner life with the outer world. They do not explain themselves logically, but they strike the soul with a truth that is felt rather than understood. The material world becomes a mirror, reflecting back to you the movements of your unconscious, the desires of your soul, the lessons you are ready to receive. This symbolic lens transforms the way you navigate life. No longer are things simply good or bad, lucky or unlucky. Events become meaningful. Challenges are seen as initiations. Delays become spaces of gestation. Even pain becomes symbolic, pointing to where energy is stuck, where growth is being demanded. The ego resists this way of seeing because it wants control. It wants certainty. But the symbolic perspective does not offer control. It offers participation. You begin to participate in your life rather than manage it. You listen more deeply, act more intuitively, trust more fully. Life becomes a conversation rather than a series of outcomes. You stop needing to figure everything out and instead begin asking, what is this trying to show me? You may find yourself drawn to nature, to art, to music, because they speak the language of symbol, the rustling of leaves, the cry of a bird, the pattern of clouds, all begin to feel like messages. A painting or a song may move you to tears, not because of its technical beauty, but because it carries something ancient that your soul recognizes. There is no explaining it to others who have not experienced this shift. They may call it imagination, or coincidence, or projection. But you know that something has awakened. You are no longer living on the surface. You are reading the deeper text behind appearances. You are no longer satisfied with literal explanations. You want to know what things mean beneath their surface, what energy they carry, what truth they conceal. You may begin to feel the presence of guides, ancestors, archetypes, not as external beings, but as living symbols within the psyche. You begin to understand that the mind is not isolated, not bounded by the skull, but connected to a deeper matrix of intelligence. This intelligence moves in images, in rhythms, in synchronicities. It is not something you own. It is something you align with. You become aware of a living field of consciousness that speaks through everything, and you begin to trust its voice. Not blindly, but sensitively, You test it. You follow a symbol, you act on a dream, and you watch how life responds over time. You learn that when you ignore this symbolic language, you feel disoriented and disconnected. But when you honor it, even if it makes no rational sense, you feel aligned, seen, guided. This way of living is not always comfortable. It demands a new kind of attention, a new kind of humility. You can no longer dismiss things as random. You begin to realize that your inner state shapes what appears around you, that your thoughts, emotions, and beliefs are not private. They are energetic patterns that interact with the field of reality. When you are angry, the world feels hostile. When you are in love, everything glows. When you are centered, synchronicities multiply. This awareness can be overwhelming. It can lead to a period of retreat, of recalibration. As you learn to navigate life with this deeper sensitivity, you may begin to understand myths and religious stories in a new way. Not as literal histories, but as psychological maps. You see yourself in the journey of the hero, in the descent into the underworld. In the battle between light and shadow, these stories become guides. They do not tell you what to do, but they show you that others have walked this path before. They remind you that the soul has its own logic, its own trajectory, and that you are not alone in your journey. The symbolic world holds you, teaches you, shapes you. As this perception deepens, inner guidance becomes clearer. Not in the form of commandments or rigid doctrines, but as a soft inner pull, a knowing that doesn't need explanation. You begin to sense when something is right for you, even if it makes no sense to others. You begin to hear the voice of the soul, not as a loud declaration, but as a quiet certainty. You start to organize your life around this guidance. You follow it into the unknown, into choices that might seem irrational from the outside, but feel deeply true from within. The symbolic lens becomes a compass. It shows you where energy is flowing, where resistance is arising, where transformation is trying to happen. This shift cannot be reversed. Once you have seen the symbolic nature of life, you cannot unsee it. Once you have felt the world speaking to you, you can no longer pretend it is silent. Once you have followed an intuition and seen the doors it opens, you can no longer live in only rational decisions. You begin to walk the world with reverence, because everything becomes alive with meaning. Every moment carries a potential message, every encounter a possible initiation. The symbolic world is not separate from the physical world. It is its soul, its essence. Its truth unveiled authenticity becomes non-negotiable, and the soul refuses to tolerate anything false or misaligned. This transformation doesn't begin with a bold declaration, but with subtle inner shifts that accumulate until a line is crossed. At first, there might be a quiet unease, an invisible discomfort around situations where you once smiled politely, agreed passively, or played along with roles that no longer fit. The tension builds not from external pressure, but from internal contradiction. A voice begins to whisper in the background whenever you make a decision out of fear, habit, or social expectation. That voice becomes louder until you can no longer ignore it. It begins to ask questions you avoided for years. Why are you here? Who are you performing for? What are you sacrificing by pretending? There comes a point when the dissonance between your inner reality and your outer expression becomes unbearable. It is no longer about pleasing others or maintaining appearances. It becomes about survival, not of the body but of the soul. The cost of self-abandonment becomes too high. Each time you betray your own knowing, your own essence, you feel something erode inside. It's not guilt, it's grief. Grief for the parts of you that have been silenced, distorted, buried to fit into a version of life that no longer serves your growth. And this grief awakens a kind of rebellion. Not the loud, aggressive kind, but the sacred, unwavering refusal to continue living in ways that disconnect you from your truth. Authenticity is not about expressing opinions loudly or standing out for the sake of individuality. It is the practice of alignment. It is the willingness to live in a way that reflects your innermost values, regardless of how uncomfortable or inconvenient that may be. You start to notice when you're out of alignment, not as a cognitive thought, but as a visceral feeling. Your body contracts, your energy drops, your speech loses clarity. You feel fragmented, as if you're living outside your own skin. But when you're in alignment, there's a sense of ease, even in difficulty. You speak without rehearsing. You move without overthinking, and your presence carries coherence. Others may not agree with you, but they feel the integrity behind your words. That integrity becomes your anchor. The path to authenticity often begins with saying no. No to what drains you, no to what manipulates you, no to what demands you shrink. These boundaries aren't about rejection. They are about projection, protecting the sacredness of your inner life. The silence that births insight, the solitude that restores your energy. The more you live in alignment, the more sensitive you become to misalignment. Environments that once felt neutral now feel heavy. Conversations that once entertained now feel hollow. You are not judging others. You are simply no longer willing to betray your own depth to fit into surfaces. This shift can be isolating. You may lose relationships, opportunities, even status. But what you gain is a self that is no longer divided. You begin to speak more honestly, not to offend but to free yourself. You stop performing in ways that seek approval. You realize that approval gained through self-denial is a hollow victory. You recognize the subtle ways you used to bend yourself to be loved, accepted, understood. Now, you no longer chase understanding. You embody it. You no longer explain yourself endlessly. You express, and if it's not received, you let it go. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you sovereign. Your energy is no longer scattered, trying to be everything to everyone. It becomes focused, precise, rooted in who you are becoming. This authenticity also means confronting your own shadows. You begin to see the ways you lied to yourself, not out of malice, but out of survival. You forgive yourself, not to excuse, but to release. You take ownership of your choices, your projections, your patterns. You understand that being real includes being flawed. You stop aspiring to a perfect image and begin cultivating a real presence. Perfection is brittle, authenticity is fluid. It adapts, evolves, learns. You no longer fear being wrong because you trust your capacity to correct course. You no longer fear vulnerability because you trust the strength of your core. There is a clarity that begins to emerge. It's not intellectual clarity but energetic. You can walk into a space and feel what's aligned and what's not. You can meet a person and know whether your souls can speak or your masks will clash. This sensitivity is not a burden. It is guidance. It helps you navigate life without scripts. You don't need to control outcomes because you trust your response to whatever comes. You begin to live in truth, not as a concept but as a rhythm. You listen more than you speak. You act from intention rather than impulse. You surround yourself with people who nourish your truth rather than require your compromise. Authenticity also reshapes your work. Your art, your contribution. You can no longer create just to impress or sell. You create from necessity, from a fire within that seeks expression. The work may take longer, but it carries power. It may not please everyone, but it touches those who are meant to receive it. You are no longer motivated by external rewards alone. You are moved by something deeper, a desire to offer something real in a world full of noise. Your work becomes an extension of your essence, not a tool for validation. You may notice that people begin to respond differently to you. Some are drawn in, others are repelled. This is not personal, it's energetic. Your authenticity acts like a tuning fork. It resonates with what is real and disturbs what is false. You begin to attract relationships that are rooted in mutual respect, shared values, and emotional honesty. The old dynamics, codependence, manipulation, avoidance, begin to fall away. Not because you push them, but because you no longer vibrate at that level. You cannot sustain what is out of resonance. This is not spiritual elitism. It is simply the nature of energetic alignment. There is a deep peace that begins to take root. It's not the absence of conflict, but the absence of pretense. You are no longer at war with yourself. You may still feel pain, fear, uncertainty, but you meet them from a place of wholeness. You do not run from discomfort. You learn from it. You do not silence your needs. You honor them. You do not mold yourself into someone else's image. You refine your own. This peace does not come quickly, but it is lasting. It arises from knowing that you are living in alignment with your truth, that your choices reflect your inner reality, that your life is no longer a performance, but a practice of being real. Authenticity becomes not just a value but a compass. It guides your yes and your no, your silence and your speech, your movement and your stillness. You begin to recognize that the soul will not tolerate falsehood, not because it is moralistic, but because it is alive. And what is alive must breathe freely, speak truly, and move in accordance with its own rhythm. You learn that anything you gain through the sacrifice of your authenticity is not truly yours, and anything you lose in the defense of your truth was never meant to stay. The soul becomes your authority, your anchor, your guide, and once that allegiance is made, the path may narrow, but it becomes undeniably yours,